The courtroom was silent, all eyes on the woman standing before the judge. Tiana Dawson, a blind woman, stood with unwavering confidence, her cane resting against the table, her dark sunglasses concealing her expression. She was fully aware of the incredulous stares from everyone in the room. A blind woman, one who had lived her life in the dark, was about to challenge the very system that had been built to hold people like her down. Yet she stood there, calm and poised, an unreadable smile barely visible as she turned her head to face Judge Edward Hale. Judge Hale, a seasoned figure with a reputation for being harsh, leaned back in his chair, the skepticism in his voice unmistakable. "Are you telling me, Ms. Dawson, that despite being blind, you've somehow managed to draft a legal motion that outmaneuvers the prosecution, my ruling, and the entire legal system?" His words echoed in the courtroom, a mix of mockery and disbelief. Tiana's voice, smooth and calm, cut through the tension. "Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly what I'm saying." A hushed murmur swept through the room. The prosecutor, James Callahan, smirked, clearly anticipating a moment of weakness from Tiana. No one could believe that someone without sight could possibly understand the intricacies of the law, let alone manipulate it in their favor. But Tiana wasn't just any person. She was a woman who had learned to navigate a world not built for her. A woman who could hear things others couldn't, who could feel what others missed. "You see," Tiana continued, her voice unwavering, "you'll just have to find out." The entire room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. As if on cue, the doors to the courtroom swung open with a violent crash. A man, panting and out of breath, rushed in, clutching a thick file of papers. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice urgent. "You need to see this right now." Judge Hale's expression faltered for a split second. His fingers gripped the edge of his desk, and his heart skipped a beat. Something was shifting. Something big was happening. He could feel it. "What's in those papers?" Judge Hale muttered under his breath. Tiana stood still, her face unreadable. The room buzzed with anticipation, the stakes higher than ever. Weeks earlier, Tiana Dawson's life had been ordinary, until it wasn't. Blind since childhood, she had learned to rely on her other senses. She used her cane to navigate the world, heard every sound with precision, and read through Braille and text-to-speech software. She had long mastered the art of avoiding trouble, living a quiet life and volunteering at a local community center for people with disabilities. But on one crisp autumn afternoon, everything changed. Tiana was walking home from the center in downtown Chicago. The path was familiar, down the sidewalk, past a bookstore, and then 2 blocks to her apartment. The sounds of the busy street were constant. Cars honking, pedestrians chatting, the occasional distant siren. But there was something different this time, a feeling. Someone was following her. At first it was subtle, just the sound of footsteps mirroring her own, a slight shuffle, too close for comfort. Tiana's heart rate quickened, but her face remained neutral. Whoever it was, they clearly underestimated her ability to perceive the world around her. She slowed her pace, gripping her cane a little tighter. The footsteps kept pace with her, never faltering, always just behind. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She knew they were there. They thought she wouldn't notice. They were wrong. Suddenly, the hand of a stranger grabbed her arm. "Don't move!" The voice was deep, rough, unfamiliar. Tiana tilted her head slightly, listening intently. The man's breathing was steady but rushed. His grip on her arm was firm, but not aggressive. Yet there was something menacing in the air. "What do you want?" Tiana asked calmly, keeping her voice even. "You're coming with us," the man said. Tiana's other arm was suddenly grabbed by a second person. A rush of panic surged through her, but she didn't let it show. Then darkness. Deeper than the blindness she had known her whole life, a cloth pressed to her nose and mouth, and everything faded to black. When Tiana awoke, the first thing she noticed was the cold, damp smell of concrete and metal. Her head throbbed painfully. She could feel the rough texture of the chair she was sitting in, her wrists bound tightly behind her. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Someone was approaching. "Welcome back, Ms. Dawson," a voice called, cold and calculating. Tiana straightened, forcing herself to stay calm. "Who are you?" she demanded. A chuckle came from the shadows. Not important. What matters is you have something we need. Tiana frowned. I think you have the wrong person. Oh, I don't think so, the voice responded. You were the last person to speak to Benjamin Carter before he vanished. And he had something very valuable. Tiana's mind raced. Benjamin Carter. She'd met him just a week ago at the community center. He was nervous, barely speaking, handing her a thin envelope with only a simple request. Keep this safe. Before she could ask anything further, he had disappeared. But now those people were in her presence, and they wanted whatever Carter had given her. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was something that would change everything. They would soon learn that underestimating Tiana Dawson was the last mistake they'd ever make. 2 weeks earlier, Tiana Dawson's life had been as ordinary as any blind woman's could be. Despite the constant challenges of navigating a world that wasn't designed for someone like her, Tiana had built a quiet routine. She spent most days at the community center, helping people with disabilities learn new skills. At night, she returned to her small apartment in the heart of Chicago, where the sounds of the city outside her window had become a comforting backdrop to her life. But today, as she walked home from the center, something felt off. The usual rhythm of the city, honking cars, chattering pedestrians, the distant hum of sirens, was interrupted by a feeling, a strange presence. Someone was following her. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their gaze. The footsteps matched hers, too close, too deliberate. Tiana's heart rate quickened. She gripped her cane tighter, her senses sharpening. She had learned early in life to rely on her other senses: hearing, touch, intuition. Her blindness didn't make her helpless. In fact, it made her more attuned to the world around her, more aware than most people realized. Whoever was following her clearly didn't understand that. She slowed her pace, pretending not to notice. The footsteps mirrored her own, slower now, almost as if testing her. Her mind raced. What did they want? And why her? She rounded the corner, her senses alert. As she quickened her steps, she heard a man's voice, deep and menacing. "Don't move," he ordered. A strong hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back with force. Tiana's muscles tensed, but she didn't flinch. "What do you want?" she asked calmly, though her heart was pounding. Another figure appeared beside her, grabbing her other arm, securing her in place. Tiana didn't panic. She knew how to stay composed in moments of danger. They had underestimated her, thinking her blindness made her weak. She would prove them wrong. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice firm. "You're coming with us," the man said, his grip tightening. Before she could react, a piece of cloth was pressed against her nose and mouth, and the world went black. When Tiana regained consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the smell. It was cold, metallic, like damp concrete. Her head throbbed, and as she shifted, she realized her hands were bound to a chair behind her. The room was dim, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, something industrial. A voice broke the silence. It was low, cold, calculating. "Welcome back, Ms. Dawson," it said. Tiana straightened, forcing her body to remain calm, though her mind was racing. She had been through this kind of situation before. She knew how to stay in control. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady. Another voice chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Does it matter? What matters is that you have something we need." Tiana frowned. "I don't know what you're talking about." The voice grew more insistent. "Oh, I think you do. You were the last person to speak to Benjamin Carter before he disappeared." The name hit Tiana like a cold wave. Benjamin Carter. She remembered him well. He was a man she had met only a week ago at the community center, a man with nervous eyes shaking hands. He had handed her a thin envelope and whispered, "Keep this safe." That was the last time she had seen him, and now these people were here, expecting her to know something about him, something about what was in the envelope. "What did he give me?" Tiana asked, her mind racing. The voice was close now, almost mocking. "That's what we're going to find out." Tiana could feel the tension in the air, the threat behind the words. She had no idea what Carter had given her, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was important, and she was the only one who knew where it was. But one thing was clear: underestimating Tiana Dawson was the last mistake they would ever make. Tiana sat in the cold, dim room, her wrists bound tightly behind her, trying to piece together everything that had led her here. Her mind raced. She had been in danger before, but never like this. Whoever these men were, they wanted something, and they believed she had it. The envelope, the one Benjamin Carter had given her. The envelope she hadn't dared open. She could feel the weight of the room, the anticipation building. The man who had spoken earlier stood just out of reach, his presence suffocating. A chair scraped against the concrete floor as someone moved closer, the sound echoing in the empty space. Tiana tilted her head slightly, listening intently. "Tell us what Carter gave you," the voice demanded again. "We know he gave you something valuable, and you're going to tell us where it is." Tiana remained silent. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. But the pressure was mounting. These men were getting impatient. They were serious. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever Carter had risked his life for, it was worth more than she could fathom. The voice grew sharper. "We don't have time for games. Where is it?" Tiana's heart pounded, but she didn't show it. She could hear the man's breath, steady but heavy, as he paced around her. He was testing her, trying to break her, but she wouldn't give in. She had faced worse than this. She had been forced to rely on her instincts, to trust herself, and she wasn't about to start doubting that now. "I don't have it," Tiana finally said, her voice low and controlled. "I don't even know what it is." The silence that followed was deafening. The man chuckled darkly. "You're lying." Tiana's lips curved slightly. "I don't lie." A fist slammed against the table in front of her, the sound reverberating in the quiet room. "You're going to tell us what Carter gave you," the voice hissed, "or we'll make you talk." Tiana's fingers curled slightly, her senses tingling as she took in every detail. The faint rustle of fabric, the subtle shift in air as someone moved closer. She could hear their frustration, but she could also feel their weakness. They were desperate, and desperation was always a telltale sign of failure. "I told you," Tiana said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know." The man was silent for a moment, and then a new voice cut through the tension. It was calm, cold, and calculating. "Maybe she doesn't know," the voice said, softer now. "But I'm willing to bet she knows something." Tiana's heart skipped a beat as the voice became more familiar. It was the same voice that had greeted her earlier, the one that had mocked her so confidently, the person in charge, the one pulling the strings. She could feel their eyes on her now, more intense than ever. "What do you want from me?" she asked, not backing down. "Everything," the man replied. "We want everything Carter knew, and if you won't help us, we'll take it from you." Tiana exhaled slowly, her mind moving faster than ever. She had no idea what Carter had gotten himself into, but she knew this. These people were dangerous, and they didn't know who they were messing with. Back in the courtroom, Judge Edward Hale sat at his desk, flipping through the papers handed to him earlier. His face had gone pale, disbelief written across every line of his face as he scanned the contents. He couldn't believe what he was reading, but it was right in front of him, undeniable. This isn't possible," he muttered to himself. The prosecution's attorney, James Callahan, stood nearby, watching the judge closely. "What's going on, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. Judge Hale's hand trembled as he set the papers down. His gaze shifted toward the defendant, Tiana Dawson, who still stood unmoving, her expression calm, unreadable. I don't know how," Judge Hale whispered, "but she's done it." Callahan frowned. "Done what?" The judge shook his head, his mind racing. He had seen criminals try every trick in the book, but this, a blind woman outsmarting the entire legal system, it was something else entirely. Tiana had set her plan in motion, but the game was far from over. She was no longer just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting to expose the truth, and she would not stop until every piece of the puzzle was in place. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Hale stared at the documents in his hands, trying to make sense of what he was reading. The words blurred in front of him, but he could feel the weight of what they contained. This wasn't just any legal motion, it was something that threatened to bring down everything he had worked so hard to protect. He swallowed hard and turned his gaze toward Tiana Dawson. She stood there as calm as ever, her dark sunglasses hiding any trace of emotion. The quiet confidence she exuded sent a chill down his spine. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. Callahan, the prosecutor, watched with a mixture of confusion and frustration. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had been sure that Tiana was just another pawn in a larger scheme, someone who would crumble under the pressure. But now with the papers in front of him, Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that the tables had turned. Something was happening, something he couldn't quite grasp. "What's in the papers, Judge?" Callahan asked, his voice tight with unease. Judge Hale's hand trembled as he set the papers down on the desk. He looked up at Tiana. "I don't know how you did it," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "But whatever you've done, it's real, and I can't ignore it." Tiana didn't flinch. "I told you, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "You'll have to find out." The room fell silent, the gravity of her words settling in. Hale's mind raced. What did she know? What had she uncovered? He had been convinced this trial was a formality, a slam-dunk conviction. But now everything was in question. The courtroom was on edge, unsure of what would happen next. As the room buzzed with whispers, a sharp knock interrupted the silence. The door to the courtroom swung open, and in walked a woman in a gray suit, holding a large file of documents. She moved quickly, her breath ragged from her hurried entrance. She locked eyes with Judge Hale, and without a word slammed the file onto his desk. "Your Honor," she gasped, "this trial, this entire case, it's all built on a lie." The entire room went still. Everyone turned to look at her. The woman's presence was commanding, her expression determined. She didn't flinch as the eyes of the courtroom bore down on her. "I'm Elizabeth Brooks," she said, her voice strong, "a federal investigator. And I have the proof that everything you think you know about this case is wrong." Judge Hale looked up from the file in his hands. His pulse quickened. This was not what he had expected. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as people whispered about who this new player was and what she had brought to the table. Elizabeth turned toward Tiana and gave her a brief nod, as if acknowledging a silent understanding between them. Callahan jumped to his feet. "This is highly irregular," he shouted. "What is a federal agent doing barging into an active trial?" Elizabeth didn't flinch. "Because, Mr. Callahan, this trial is a sham. It was built on false evidence and manipulated from the start, and I have the documents to prove it." Her words hit like a thunderclap, shaking the entire room. The people in the courtroom were no longer sure who the real criminal was: the prosecution, the judge, or Tiana Dawson. Tiana remained seated, her face unreadable, as if she had known all along this moment would come. "I'm not here to defend Ms. Dawson," Elizabeth continued, "but to expose the truth. The man you've been trying to convict doesn't belong in that seat. He's the one who needs to be investigated." Callahan's face turned a deep shade of red. "What are you talking about?" he spat, his voice filled with disbelief. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "What I'm saying is that the real criminal is Judge Edward Hale. He's been running a criminal empire from behind the scenes, manipulating cases to cover his tracks. The documents I've brought here show that." There was a collective gasp in the room. The color drained from Judge Hale's face as he stood up, his hands trembling. "This is preposterous," he shouted, trying to maintain control, but it was clear he was losing his grip. "Enough," Elizabeth snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. She walked toward the judge and placed a single piece of paper in front of him. "You know what this is. This is a federal warrant for your arrest, Your Honor." Hale's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," he roared. Elizabeth didn't back down. "I can, and I just did." The courtroom exploded in confusion and disbelief. Some of the spectators stood, trying to process what was happening, while others just watched in stunned silence. "I know this is hard to accept," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, "but everything we've uncovered points back to you, Judge Hale. The only reason this case was even on the docket was because of your connections, your influence, your manipulation." Tiana didn't move. She wasn't surprised by any of this. She had known from the start that the system was flawed, that it was stacked against people like her. But now, with the truth exposed, the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Elizabeth turned back to Tiana and nodded. "It's over, Ms. Dawson. You've won." The courtroom was in chaos. People rushed to grab their things, reporters scrambling to record every word, every movement. Elizabeth stood tall, unfazed by the chaos around her. Tiana remained seated, her fingers lightly tapping the table, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had done it. Against all odds, she had outsmarted the entire system. She had exposed the truth, and now Judge Hale's empire was crumbling. Federal agents moved swiftly, placing handcuffs on Judge Hale, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. His protests were met with the cold, unyielding silence of those around him. He had lost everything: the power, the control, all of it. And in the end, it had been a blind woman who had brought it all down. As Hale was dragged away, Tiana stood up, adjusting her dark sunglasses. She felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything she had worked for. She had known that the system was corrupt, but she had never imagined it would be this easy to expose. The truth was a powerful weapon, and now she had wielded it. Elizabeth walked over to her, offering a hand. "You did it, Tiana. I have to admit, I didn't think this would happen." Tiana shook her hand, her smile unwavering. "I knew it would. The truth always comes out, one way or another." As they walked toward the exit, Tiana's mind raced. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. The corrupt forces that had been running the city, the ones who thought they were untouchable, would be looking for retribution. But she was ready for whatever came next. She always had been. 2 days later, Tiana sat in a quiet cafe, the weight of the past few days settling in. Her body was sore from the events, but the satisfaction of victory kept her going. Robert Hayes, her old friend and former cop, sat across from her, his eyes narrowed with concern. "You know you're not safe, right?" Robert asked, his voice low. "These people don't take kindly to being exposed. You've got a lot of powerful enemies now." Tiana nodded slowly. "I know, but they've been running things for too long. It's time for a change." Robert sighed, rubbing his face. "You always were a stubborn one. I just don't want to see you get hurt." Tiana smiled faintly. "I've been ready for this since the moment Carter handed me that envelope." Robert leaned back in his chair, still uneasy. "You've got a hell of a plan, Tiana. I'll give you that." Tiana's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Elizabeth. "We have a problem," it read. Robert raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Tiana stood up, slipping her phone into her pocket. "They're coming for me again," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But this time, they'll have to work harder." She turned to Robert, who was already on his feet, ready to follow. "You in?" she asked, a knowing smile on her lips. Robert didn't hesitate. "I've been in since the beginning." They walked out of the cafe, the weight of what was to come hanging in the air. But Tiana knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done. The fight wasn't over, and she would keep pushing, keep fighting for justice, no matter the cost. As they made their way to the street, the hum of the city filled the air. Tiana felt the weight of every step, the sense that something bigger was on the horizon. She had taken down one criminal empire, but there were always more to uncover, always more to fight for. And as the night fell, Tiana Dawson knew that she would never stop, because in a world of corruption and lies, someone had to be the one to expose the truth.